Hello, this is your guide, John Baugh, CIS 1440. This is week 12. I've discovered a couple interesting things about the chapters, 14 through 16 in Murrock. A couple of the later chapters, some of the stuff in 15 and 16, is actually outdated because, for example, Twitter does not offer an insecure or unauthorized API anymore. So I would say just make your focus about a little more on chapter 14, and also make sure that you focus on chapters 12 and 13 from jQuery. I will try to make the um, review itself, and also as we drift towards the capstone project, I will make sure that it reflects these facts. But you should have a fundamental idea about what Ajax and JSON are and what an API is by the time that we're done with this. And also, I hope that you took the time to read through the different chapters and look through the examples on jQuery UI last week. I assigned you program 3. I did get the material up a little later than I had anticipated, so I believe I made the due date a little bit further. Um, so let me double check here. Yeah, the due date was extended by a few days, so the due date on the actual document is should show you the extension. So let me look here, double check. Okay, I'm just looking through the actual document that I gave you. Most of the material, or the material on the project 3, is for chapters 12 and 13. So they have to do with the jQuery UI. So they should be just fine for you to work with. So don't sweat too bad about the API Ajax chapters, the later ones especially, because there are quite a bit of problems actually in these chapters. So it's not just Twitter. There's some other things that no longer offer insecure APIs as well. However, if you do sign up as a Twitter developer or YouTube or Flickr or one of those, you can get what's called an API key, see what their current documentation says, and it shouldn't be that difficult to work with them. So if you get the fundamental ideas of what we're talking about today, I'm going to go over a few of these, and I also actually created a website that I not only uploaded the slides just for posterity's sake to the D2L site, I created a website that I called, I think it was the actual thing was called UI and Ajax. Yeah, so there's a zip file up there called UI and Ajax. It contains all the stuff you need to import. But notice that the jQuery UI, one thing to note, um, if you didn't notice this before, which you should have by now, you don't just download jQuery UI like you did with regular jQuery. jQuery UI sits on top of the jQuery UI, but usually you want a custom download. If you do a stable download, I believe downloads the whole thing essentially, jQuery UI. But if you want a custom one, which is usually used, you need the core, and then certain things depend on others, like draggable and droppable. So this is kind of last week's information, and then some of these depend on other things as well, like one another. For example, droppable doesn't work unless you have draggable enabled. But sometimes you may not care about the effects or things like that, so you can uncheck a couple and it'll actually make your download and the file itself smaller. But I've included in here the JavaScript. You've got the jQuery UI custom.min.js. This is from a slightly earlier version, but it works just fine. You can download the newest one. There's also CSS files and images that come with a download when you download it. And you might think, well, what's that about, and what's all these crazy numbers? Well, these are actually all generated in order to make really, really cool UIs. So you basically can define a UI, pick a theme, do a lot of cool stuff with that, and then when you download it, it comes with CSS and um, image files. So become familiar with there's just too much to go over even in one class. You could have probably an entire year or at least an entire semester looking over the jQuery UI, and you'd never get tired of all the possibilities. But I have created a custom one based on one of the ones they had. So this one's going to actually use very basic Ajax and also uses jQuery UI, which is something I didn't see them do combining in the book. I would also recommend if you have the Ducket book, the book with the black cover that gets your fingers dirty with ink every time you turn pages. That book is fantastic in some areas, and the UI section is really good. So I'd recommend that one as well. You can look over that one. Okay, so chapter 14, though, we will go over some of these slides, and then I'll just show you the example, and then leave you to your research and study and finishing off project 3. So you've got how to use Ajax, JSON, and Blogger. We're not really going to cover the Blogger stuff, but we should become familiar with what is Ajax and other things. So auto-suggest, for example, that Google uses is, in fact, an Ajax application. So this is how a normal HTTP request is processed. So the web browser sends an HTTP request to a web server. That sends information or sends requests to the application server, which has scripts on it, and sometimes that has to pull data from a database server. This is what you would call the 3-tier architecture. And then the interaction between web browser and web server is you can think of as a 2-tier or a client-server interaction, but this really uses 3 tiers. You've got the data, the applications themselves, which pull data, and then the web server, which sends the information, the presentation, to the web browser, which actually performs the presentation. So these are kind of involved in the presentation aspects. But this is how it normally works. Now, with a fully fledged Ajax application, it sends an object or request, XML, HTTP request. It sends it to the web server, and then the web server doesn't respond with a full-fledged HTML page. It just sends back the data. So you might think, well, what is the purpose of this? Well, the purpose is we don't always want to load an entire page. You may not want to refresh an entire page. In fact, if you've used Facebook or other social networking and things like that, it doesn't, every time you leave a comment, it doesn't, send a request to Facebook and it sends back the whole page. It just shows you the comment just shows up. Same thing when you're sitting there and you see things update, that's Ajax. You're not refreshing the whole page. You don't see the whole thing go blank and then reload. That would not only be a little bit annoying, it would be, it'd take a lot more data to do so because you're passing the whole page. The response from the web server in this scenario with Ajax is just the data that needs replaced. So what is Ajax? Well, Ajax is, the term means asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Now, you don't have to always use XML, and it tends to refer to it as a generic term for a set of technologies that provide rich internet interactivity. Okay, usually the generic term or the general term we use for Ajax is rich internet application features. So use the asynchronous JavaScript with XML. If you use the JavaScript and the XML, then it is actually Ajax. But sometimes you don't have XML as the data format. Sometimes you have JSON. Sometimes you have regular text, HTML, all kinds of stuff. So XML HTTP request is sometimes referred to as an XHR object. This is the object that requests and then also receives the data from the server. The term API is Application Programming Interface. So here are the common data formats. So this is the whole idea is that you want to know how do we transfer data from one source to another. And there are many different formats in general that you can transfer data. But the common data formats for Ajax are HTML, which is probably the most simple. XML is very, very popular. Um, XML is used extensively, and overall, it's the most popular language for data transmission and data integration. With JavaScript, the JSON JavaScript object notation is actually very frequently used as well. So this is what XML looks like. You would have, it looks very similar to HTML, if you notice, but XML is extensible markup language, which means based on a schema or not, you can define certain new tags, new elements, and you can have sub-elements, and you define attributes and things like that. This particular XML data file seems to have a root element called management, and it has some sub-elements called team member. So each of this, there's 2 team member elements, and then each of those has a name, a title, and a bio sub-element, and then the data in between. So that's a very common format for transmitting data. There's another format, though, the JSON format that we talked about a little bit ago. This looks a little bit different. It's not the same format as we saw with the XML, but you'll notice that this has a format that sets up the team members here, then a bracket and a bracket closing and opening bracket, and the curly braces which match up. And then each of these is just kind of like an empty body. Well, not empty body, but the body has no header. If you were in a programming language, you just have curly brace, comma, curly brace, curly brace. If you had more items, you would put another comma, more data, etc. But this basically contains the same data as the XML that we just saw. So names Agnes, titles this, bios that. Same thing here, names that, names Agnes, titles this, bios that. So you just see it's a different format. The developers, the people that provide you with the parsing capability for this, are the ones that decide, what does this mean? What does this, how do we parse this? How do we take this, basically, which is just a large text string? Same thing here. This is a text string at the end of the day. It's just ASCII characters. How do we take it and how do we parse it or make sense out of it? Okay, break it up into components and get the data out of it. Well, most of that you don't have to do manually because it's been done for you. So you should be familiar with these terms. You don't need to learn the languages fully, but the more familiar you become with XML and also JSON, the better you will be in understanding data formats. A lot of times people who go into programming and web development do focus a lot, especially back-end developers, and desktop and systems developers, they tend to focus a lot on instructions. They focus on telling the computer, do this, do that, do that, do that. And that's really what jQuery and JavaScript are all about, is telling it to do something. However, if you learn more about these languages, XML and JSON, you will learn more about another aspect of things that are held in memory by computers, which is not the instructions, but the data. Okay, so you learn more about the data. So data is just as important. These are members of the XML HTTP request object. You've got methods, properties, and events. These are all the methods. Send and open are very commonly used. The properties, like ready state, response text, response XML, this is the stuff that comes back when there's a response. And then there's the event on ready state change. So I did upload it. In fact, you can play around with it. There's the web page that uses the XML HTTP request object and JavaScript to load XML data. And then there's an empty div here, and they just basically load it when you click the different buttons and such. So I think they might have used a little bit of jQuery UI in here. I don't recall 100%, but the example I give, and just a little bit that I came up with, uses tabs, which I didn't see them using tabs with jQuery UI, and that's where the tabs come from. I didn't see them using that with JSON or with XML, so no Ajax stuff there. Okay, and they go through the JavaScript. These states, you should at least read up on these. If you've ever seen, an error page, it'll say like status some number, 404 or what have you. When the page isn't found or there's an error on the page, when you load websites, you might see these random errors. Well, the status 200 indicates that a page was loaded successfully. And then this indicates that the XML or XML HTTP response object is ready. Everything's ready. So you get the data, and then they show you how to parse it. So you go through the when you get elements by tag name, notice that you have get elements by tag name here. That gets the tag name team member. If we go back to the XML here, it gets each of the team members, and they're looping through right here. I guess I could have used this one. They're looping through here based on the length of team. Notice this is get elements by tag name, not get element. So it gets however many team members. There could be 100, could be 20. It doesn't really matter. This will add to the HTML variable which we've created above the loop. It'll go through and it will utilize the different child node. So if you've got, for example, the name at whichever name it is, child node's node value. That will actually that should have a double quote right there, just so you're aware. I think that the stuff that I uploaded is right, but in the slide it's wrong here. This should have a double quote. I would normally put a backslash actually after the R also, because I think that's actually HTML5 standard. But anyway, they've got the HTML here, and it's concatenating this data here. It'll show the name, then line break, and then the next one, then a line break, and then the bio, and then 2 line breaks after, so it gets ready for the next one. After the loop, which seems to be here and there, it gets the element team in the HTML, sets the inner HTML to whatever the HTML data was from this string, because this isn't a special symbol, this is just a variable name they used. The method that you'll see in my example a lot is the load, or the important method here. There's also get and post, which should be very familiar to you. Get and post are used frequently with XML data, and load is used a lot with HTML data. Get JSON is used for, not surprisingly, the JavaScript object notation data, JSON data. And then each method is used to process or move through the different data that's returned. So, some examples here. If I take this section here and I call load solutions.html, if I'm in a particular page, I can get a separate page and then load that into this section, okay, without reloading my whole page. You can also specify a section of here in load if I put space, colon, not colon, pound sign, content or something like that. If there's an ID inside of solutions.html called content, it will transfer that data into this section here called solution. More advanced features of Ajax is that you can actually have data processed and changed on the fly. For example, if I have a PHP file or something like that, I can pass it some data and then have it call a specific method when the data is returned that will handle the data that comes back. And here's an example of the get JSON method. So you have the JSON file that you're asking for, that's sometimes a full URL, and then you have a function that processes the data that is returned. So this parameter here is the data that is returned. So that's a success function. Then they go through and just show you how to utilize it. So it's pretty, that part's pretty straightforward. Let me see here. 2 ways to send data with an Ajax request. They've got the get, you pass the name, and then the show manager, which processes it when you're done. Notice show manager is just the name of a function that we define afterwards that will actually handle whatever data is returned. Okay, so just to be aware, there are serialize and serialize array. This can serialize them into an appropriate form of data that can be sent. So process return data is here. the get. If I call get on process contract, you take the form data and then I call serialize on it. It puts it in a serialized form, which is ready to be sent to the process contact.php file. And then that's the name of the call, what we call a callback function that will be activated after the this function has been called. This method's been fully called. Another way is using the Ajax method. This gives you a little more control over things, so you can get padded JSON data, error data, cache, URL. These are properties. There's tons and tons of things that you can do in the Ajax method. So that one I will leave as an exercise for you to look through. Let me see here. What do we got here? Okay, so there we're not going to go into the blogger stuff. So just look over the chapter, look over all the chapters, but be aware that some of the later chapters don't quite function the way you would think. They don't properly work, in fact. For this example that I uploaded, the UI with Ajax, I have the jQuery UI here. You could include jQuery also, but I've gone to the code base at Google, so the I'm loading this from googlecode.com. So there's googlecode.com, this is the shiv, and then this jQuery is from the code.jQuery.com. Sorry, I think I said Google for jQuery, but that's not what I meant. The shiv is from Google Code, and then this is being loaded from the site. But you could have it locally. It could be an updated version of jQuery. That's fine. But notice that inside of my local folder, JS, I have the jQuery UI, custom min. Since this is using tabs, you take the # tabs, call the tabs function, which prepares the tabs. It treats each of these in the unordered list, tabs 1, tabs 2, tabs 3, as tabs instead of just basic anchors. And then you'll notice that I did this. I have tabs 1 just has some basic information in it. Tabs 2, same thing, just a paragraph with information. Tabs 3, those are a little more complicated, and this is the one that uses very basic Ajax. So you've got href set for each of these. The links will say load page 1, load page 2, load page 3. They'll be right next to each other because I did not put a break in between them here. I could put a break, it doesn't really matter. And this is kind of where the magic will happen. I've got a section with an ID of content and a div with an ID of container. Notice the container is empty. So if we look at the load data JavaScript file that I created in the ready function, I search for something with the ID tabs 3, which is this one, right? And then I say I put space A, which means any anchor tag. I set the click event handler to have a function inside of it, or to call a function, anonymous function here. This is function E, a function that takes E as a parameter. This is the event that triggered it. So what you do here at the beginning, or at some time during the function really, is you say e.preventDefault. That will prevent it from opening the next page, right? So many of you have probably discovered this from one of your projects, that it kept the one where you look through the different books and you want to change enlarge the book in the page when you click on it and it shows the book. Many of you found that you had to prevent the default behavior in order for it to work properly. So this prevents the default behavior of an anchor tag, which is, in other words, to go to that page. So it loads that page entirely, and that's not what we want. We want to control the behavior. So what I do is I set the URL to this URL, which means this page's URL's href, hypertext reference, and then I remove whatever content is in the old container, so any of the data in there, and then I set content, I call load URL plus space ID container. Then I hide it and then fade it in slowly. Okay, this is part of the jQuery that you learned much earlier on. You can slowly move in the data that you load. So you might want to know what the URL, why this is being concatenated with container, and I'll show you. Inside of my files, if we look here, in the index, see how this is, the hrefs are my file / load. These are very simple, it's just a simple HTML. But notice that I have container here as the ID in each of these pages. This is the second page and the third page. This is the only thing I want to grab from this page. I don't need the body, I don't need any other data. I just need this guy right here, and then it's going to manipulate the document object model, and it will take this empty container here and fill it with whatever data I choose, which is in these other files. So that is Ajax. It's a very basic usage of it, but it is still Ajax. So this is some of the jQuery UI. Click on that, click on that. So the first two are very simple, but notice this one has 3 links in it. And instead of going to the page, load page, that would be the default. If you look at the bottom, even if I say load page 2, you'll notice in the bottom it will say, that it's at the local host, that it tells the file. This is running it through a server, basically. It would normally load that page directly, but I prevented the default behavior. If we don't do that, it'll go to the page fully. It'll replace this whole page. But notice what happens. It's not refreshing any of this. It's just refreshing the data in that section, and it's using the fade effect. That's pretty cool. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty decent. It's not that difficult to understand. So I hope that really helps you, and I hope you can maybe play around with it. Maybe try to get this to happen or work with an accordion instead of the tabs. Try to use the accordion. So notice that whatever page you left it on, whatever data you left in here, when you come back from another tab, it's still there. So that's kind of useful. Maybe try to play around with this one. Make it load an image instead of just basic data here. Try to make it load an image. There's another challenge. So I hope that was useful. This is a little bit different than I normally do it. Normally I would go through all the slides possible, but I think there's just too much information to pull at once. And so I want you to focus on chapters 12, 13, and some of 14, the first part of 14 up to the blogger, and just be aware that you can interact with APIs, which are the application programming interfaces of other sites like Twitter and YouTube. You can load videos onto your page directly from YouTube's API very easily if you have the appropriate authentication. So, but a lot of chapter 15 and I believe 16 is no longer fully valid because they make statements like, you can access all the Twitter feeds without being authorized. That's not the case anymore. You can't do that. I believe their updated version of the jQuery book, they now have Murak's jQuery. They also have a jQuery and a JavaScript book, so they're 2 separate books now, but they're both very big. So if they were to have made it into one book, it would be probably 1.5 times bigger than the current book, so they wanted to kind of focus it. So if you do pick up the newer version, I would recommend the jQuery one if you're going to pick one. But it's probably got some updated examples in it. I haven't checked it out, but we'll see what happens. All right, so hopefully that was helpful. I hope you have a good week. Have a good Thanksgiving for those of you who are watching this in 2015 for fall. This is right before Thanksgiving week. So I hope you have a good break. Thanks, and have a great day. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at jpbaugh@oaklandcc.edu.